The proper flow of blood to all parts of the body is essential for life. So let's take a look at why. Blood performs multiple essential functions for us. They can be summarized as blood transports, regulates, and protects the body. So let's take a look at a few specific examples. So blood helps us transport nutrients and waste products. Those might be glucose and amino acids that we're going to use to build ATP or build new parts of the body. It also transports fatty acids, hormones, waste products that we need to get away from body tissues to the kidneys so they can be expelled. It also helps us transport hormones from where they're made to their target cells. In terms of regulation, we use blood to distribute heat through the body. That heat is carried in the watery part, the plasma part of blood. It also helps us move buffer molecules that help us regulate body pH, which has to be held fairly strictly around 7.4. We use blood to help us regulate where fluids are so that we can shunt blood or move it to places like the muscles when they're moving, or places like the heart when it's doing endurance work or extra work, or it's maybe to the digestive system when we're actually in parasympathetic mode, resting, digesting, maintaining, rebuilding the body. Additionally, blood helps us protect ourselves. So we use blood as an agent of the immune system, which is a functional system rather than an anatomical system. We have platelets in blood that help us prevent blood loss, along with clotting factors. And then we also use blood to help us protect ourselves from antigens. Antigens are considered anything that's foreign to that body, that's not self. And they come in two basic varieties or categories. There are pathogens, disease-causing organisms, or liquids or structures or fibers, and then allergens, to which some of us have hypersensitive reactions, such as food allergies. And we act on these antigens by using antibodies, complement proteins, and the white blood cells that are in blood that are moving throughout the body. So we'll come back to antibodies when we study the immune system, but this is a quick summary of what they do. They are protein-based chemicals that can mark an antigen for destruction, or, as you can see up here, take an antigen out of play. Actually move it or bind to it so that it comes out of solution and it's no longer harmful to us or has a lesser ability to be harmful to us. Sometimes antibodies will, I like to say, frost. Like frosting on a cake makes it better. Binding of antibodies to infected cells or even to specific microbes can cause those microbes to be destroyed, to burst. It can trigger things like inflammation or complement activation, or that frosting, which is also called opsonization, that's a technical word for it, makes that microbe tastier to a phagocyte. Here's some average characteristics for blood. When we talk about whole blood, we're talking about plasma, the watery part of blood, and its formed elements, the red blood cells, erythrocytes, white blood cells, leukocytes, and the platelets, thrombocytes. We call them formed elements because mature red blood cells and mature platelets don't actually have a nucleus, so they aren't considered true cells. The normal average volume of blood in a human body is about 5 liters, and that will vary depending on the health of the person, the size of that body, how well the kidneys work, and how much adipose tissue there is. The more tissue there is in the body, the more blood that's needed to supply it. When you touch blood, it has sort of a sticky, slightly thick consistency to it. The brighter it is, generally, the more highly oxygenated it is. Now, when we talk about blood vessels, we talk about blood vessels carrying oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood, which is a bit of a misnomer. Oxygen, or rather blood, has oxygen in it pretty much all the time. It gets darker with less oxygen, which is what you could see if you were bleeding and then that stopped and you have a scab that forms. In general, blood in a healthy individual makes up about 8% of body weight, and its pH that we'll work with through our class is about 7.4. So that's the standard we're going to use for our course. But if you go to different institutions, you may find that they use a range from 7.2 to 7.4. So as I mentioned earlier, whole blood is 55% plasma and about 45% formed elements. So now we're going to take a little bit of closer look at plasma and see what plasma actually does for us. So one of the most important things to know is that plasma is approximately 90% water. 55% of whole blood is plasma, and then 90% of that 55% is water. And it's the water that allows us to dissolve solutes and hormones, proteins, wastes, nutrients in that plasma and transport it around the body. So you can think of plasma like a liquid taxi sort of system. Some of the solutes that we'll find in water, remember water is the solvent. Anything that is in the water, dissolved in the water, is considered the solute. Might be electrolytes, like calcium that we're transporting between muscles so that they can contract. Sodium, potassium that help us generate action potentials or that help us regulate water balance. Remember, water moves towards sodium, and glucose, it moves towards proteins. And then in this list, you can see several other both cations and anions that are found in blood. And this isn't a complete list, it's certainly not. Proteins in blood are essential in many different ways. One of them, albumin, is considered the most abundant, the most high amount of protein that's found in human blood, made in the liver. One of its jobs is to pull water to itself. It's osmotically active, so it helps us to pull water back from capillary beds as we're doing nutrient and fluid exchange. You may have seen in practice that bodies that don't have healthy livers, don't produce enough albumin, can develop a disorder called ascites or ascites, in which you'll see fluid pool in the legs, you'll see it pool in the abdomen, and sometimes that's from lack of albumin, sometimes it might be a different cardiovascular issue. Albumin is also an important clinical measure of how healthy a liver is in that body. One of the other things that albumin does, which we learn with hormones, is it binds to those small T3, T4 hormones and helps to transport those so that they aren't degraded as they move from the thyroid gland to their target cells. Gamma globulins are antibodies. These are those proteins I mentioned earlier that help us defend ourselves from antigens. Alpha and beta globulins, globular proteins. Albumin's also a globular protein. Those, also made by the liver, are part of the lipoproteins, dietary cholesterols. They also help us transport ions like iron so that the iron doesn't cause degradation in the body. Transferrin, hemosiderin, we'll see those a little bit later with red blood cells. And some alpha and beta globulins make up hemoglobin, that essential part of red blood cells that allows us to transport oxygen. Fibrinogen, the O gen tells us that it's an inactive protein. That one, also made by the liver, is part of making stable blood clots. It forms sort of like a mesh in which red blood cells and platelets get caught and help us make a physical plug to wherever we've had a breach in a blood vessel. I happened upon this study at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I thought it was a really interesting one, given that we found lots of people were socially isolated without being able to go outside, and that there are some health effects from social isolation. More recently, there was a study that connected social isolation in the elderly with an increased incidence 1.3 times development of dementia or developing dementia. So in this study, they found that people who were socially isolated seemed to have changes in fibrinogen levels that were comparable to smoking or some of the socioeconomic differences we see when it comes to preventative medical care, and thus they were more likely to have higher rates of chronic inflammation and cardiovascular disease and death. So back to plasma. Here's a few of the other components that you're likely to see in healthy plasma. You might find things like urea, uric acid, creatine. These all come from metabolism or catabolism of proteins in the diet or cell turnover as we're making new muscle. The organic nutrients, some of which I'd mentioned before, those include carbohydrates, glucose, fructose, those monosaccharides that help us make energy for cells, amino acids, which are stored in the liver and then help us make new proteins. Proteins being essential to the rebuilding, repair, and maintenance of pretty much every body part, even down to cells. Fatty acids, we can use those to make new cells. We can also use them to burn or catabolize to make energy. Phospholipids, part of every cell membrane, also part of bile. And cholesterols that help us make more cells. And some of the hormones. Vitamins as well. A, B, C, D, E, a whole bunch of B's in there as well. And then respiratory gases. So we transport some O2 and some CO2 as dissolved gases in blood. In other cases, those two molecules will bind to other ones that are in blood and help transport them efficiently. So knowing these norms, these normal values that we've just talked about, allows us to test blood and look at what's happening in the body at a particular moment in time. So here's a few examples of common blood tests. This is a hematocrit test, and in this test, blood is put into a tube and centrifuged, so it's spun somewhere around 6,500 revolutions per minute. And the heavy components, which are the blood cells, the formed elements, will fall to the bottom of the tube. The lighter part, the plasma, should sit at the top. And in a normal one, you can see these values are expected. What this means in this case is that 42 to 52% of the whole blood is blood cells. So that's for male values. These are for people who are assigned female at birth. In an anemia or a polycythemia, an anemia where there are too few red blood cells, and a polycythemia in which there are too many, you'll see these values change significantly. We could also do a metabolic panel, a CBC or complete blood count with a differential white blood cell count and platelet count, a lipid panel, or just a diff count on its own.